ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
This conversation includes content that may be sensitive for some listeners.
Journalist Jon Ronson is known for putting himself in uncomfortable positions, researching skinheads, writing about people who believe the world is run by giant, blood-drinking lizard people, and exploring the experiences of being publicly shamed. To top it all off, nearly 15 years ago, he wrote a book about how to spot a psychopath, and he went and tested his newfound knowledge on actual psychopaths. He spoke to people unable to feel empathy, who'd instigated mass, violent crimes or ruined the livelihoods of entire towns just to make a buck. Jon's book, The Psychopath Test, has been republished by Pan Macmillan, and he's created a live show on the topic that's been touring around the world. Hello, Jon.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. You wrote this book many years ago now. Why are you returning to this now?
Well, partly selfishly, I just love the stories and I love to tell the stories. But also, I think it's kind of interesting to return to the subject every few years to see how our relationship with psychopaths kind of evolve over the years. And I think these days, certain items on the psychopath checklist are being widely encouraged, especially on social media. Unashamedness. I think we've created a sort of generation of transgressors who just refuse to feel ashamed. Partly it's our fault for like overusing public shaming as a weapon. It's like we've turned them into like kind of hospital superbugs impervious to treatment. So there's that. Also, I think the kind of highly selective empathy that is encouraged on social media when you're empathetic to your own group but you have no empathy for anyone else is another form of lack of empathy, which is on the psychopath checklist. And also the a kind of adherence to ideology. I was having a conversation, I was in my hotel in Melbourne yesterday with a journalist, and he told me that his editor had said to him that the purpose of journalism is to provide moral clarity. And when I heard that, I thought that is the worst idea I've heard in my life.
We're not always the most moral people.
No, absolutely. And also, the purpose of journalism, I think, is to provide non-partisan, non-aligned objectivity. If you're searching for moral clarity or ideology, if you're trying to be an ideological journalist, that is always going to lead you to lying, to pathological lying. Because if you care more about ideology than facts, then you're going to tell biased, untrue stories. And I think the sort of rise of activism and ideology in journalism, while it's very positive sometimes, is very negative in other ways. And I think, again, it promotes another item on the psychopath checklist, which is pathological lying, when people care more about ideology than facts. So for all of those reasons, plus there's been a great expansion of mental health diagnoses the past few years, which I think are sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So for all of those reasons, returning to the world of psychopathy and mental health labelling is always really interesting.
We should probably at this point define what is a psychopath.
Well, it's a 20-point checklist devised by a man called Robert Hare. So you have to score on like 15 of the 20 points, roughly, to be a clinical psychopath. And those things are grandiose self-worth, glib superficial charm, impulsivity, cunning manipulative. And then the big one is lack of empathy. I think all the other items on the checklist spring from that big one, lack of empathy. And if you score, as I say, about sort of 3/4 of the items, then you're a psychopath.
When you went to go meet psychopaths eventually for writing the book, did you have an expectation of what they would be like? And did that match with reality?
Actually, no, I didn't really. One of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was people would say to me, 1 in 100 people is a psychopath, although that figure rises to 4% of CEOs and business and political leaders.
Which is incredible.
Which is incredible, right? The idea that of all the mental disorders, we decide to reward the worst one. But people would say that psychopaths may look human and act human, but they're actually more akin to wild animals than human beings.
Wow.
Yeah, they're more like predatory animals. They're like another species. And you hear that over and over again from people who work with psychopaths or people who are like married to psychopaths. And I just thought, that's a huge thought and a challenging thought.
Yeah, it's almost dehumanizing language.
Exactly. And I spend my life trying to tell complicated stories about complicated humans. Good people do stupid things, stupid people do good things. We're all a complicated mess. We're grey areas. And clinicians were saying to me, well, that's true for 99% of us, but 1% of us are actually just one thing. They're just bad. They just spread malevolence. They're like wild animals. And, as a humanist, that was a huge thought. So that was the reason why I wanted to do this book. So I really didn't know what to expect.
And you did go and learn how to administer that checklist you talked about. How did you learn that?
Well, the father of psychopathy research, Robert Hare, taught me. I went on a 3-day course, so I'm a certified, and I have a certificate of attendance, psychopath spotter. Now, I know a 3-day course doesn't sound that much, but it turns out that in America, there are these places called civil commitment centres. So let's say you've committed a sex crime, you go to prison. The day you're released, if you are deemed from afar to score high on this Robert Hare psychopath checklist, you can be taken from prison and put in a civil commitment centre, which is just like a big windowless warehouse. And you stay there for the rest of your life. And the people who decide who deserves to go into those places are people who've done the same course I've done, like a 3-day course.
So not psychologists or psychiatrists?
No. Robert Hare said to me that I was concentrating more than on the course that those people did.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, those people are like twiddling their thumbs and doodling, and they're the ones who have this huge power.
Yeah. And so Robert Hare developed his checklist during his time working in prisons in the 1960s. Famously a time when the ethical guardrails for research weren't really there.
Especially in Canada.
Yeah. Can you tell me about his electric shock experiment?
Yes. So in Canada in the early 70s, you were allowed to electrocute psychopaths in prison experiments. So Hare got a bunch of psychopaths and a bunch of non-psychopath placebo volunteers and hooked them up to electricity generators and heart monitors and so on, and said, I'm going to count backwards from 10, and when I get to 1, you're going to have a very painful electric shock. And what he discovered was that the non-psychopaths were their hearts were pounding, they were sweating, whereas the psychopaths, nothing, no rise in heart rate.
Why?
Because they don't get nervous,
right.
It turns out. There's an Australian diagnosed sociopath TikTok influencer called Kanika, and she talks about this in one of her TikToks that I was watching. She says, my heart does not go up even when I'm crossing the road and a car's zooming towards me.
Wow.
It's just part of the makeup.
And so when Robert Hare did this experiment, shocking these prisoners or volunteers and realized that their heart rates didn't go up, how much of a breakthrough was that?
I think for him it was kind of extraordinary. It fed into his idea that he said this phrase to me. He said, it's almost as if they're another species.
Right.
Yeah, so he said that to me. When he repeated the test to them, he was even more amazed because the same thing happened. This time they knew how painful the electric shock was going to be, and still nothing, no rise in heart rate, nothing. It was as if they had forgotten the pain of the punishment, which may answer the question, why is there such a recidivism rate? Why do they reoffend so often?
Right.
It's as if it's like they hate being in prison, but then when they leave prison, they very quickly forget the pain of the punishment.
When you did the training with Robert Hare, there was a moment where he flashed up a very graphic photo without any warning. What did that image show?
So he was showing, it was like on our last day, and he was showing photographs of ducks on lakes and, sweet things like that. And then from nowhere, he flashed up a photograph of a close-up of a face that had been shot. So there was, just a horrific image of somebody who'd been shot in the face.
How did you feel when you saw that?
I felt like, whoa!
Right.
Because my amygdala, the part of my brain that signals, distress and so on, flashed up. I have anxiety disorders, so my amygdala is constantly sending signals of distress and remorse up and down to my central nervous system. Whereas Hare's point in showing that photograph is that psychopaths, that doesn't happen. Their amygdala doesn't light up. And in fact, if they express any emotion when looking at images like that, it's not horror, it's curiosity.
So psychopathy is not just a psychiatric thing, not just a mental illness. There's actually a physical difference in the brain?
Yeah, it's a neurological condition as far as I can tell.
How did psychiatry describe psychopathy before Robert Hare's checklist?
Madness without delusions. I can't remember it was in another language, and I've forgotten the other language, but it basically translates as madness without delusions. It's this idea that the madness is buried deep under the surface, and you can be with somebody potentially for years before you know that something's terribly wrong.
Someone who's been mostly forgotten in the history of psychopathy research is another Canadian psychiatrist named Elliot Barker. In the 1960s, again, a wild time, he was just starting out his career, and he landed in California where he encountered nude psychotherapy. What was all of that about?
Yeah, he was a huge fan of naked psychotherapy. So, as you know, like in Canada, in Northern California in the late 60s, all around kind of the Esalen Institute and so on, people were trying out these kind of crazy ideas. And one of them was naked psychotherapy.
And what was the idea there? Why would that be an effective thing?
Well, that I don't really know, like why they thought that was a good idea. I guess it was all to do with, making it intense and unshackling ourselves from all of the, life's modernity, the kind of suffocating nature of modernity.
Right.
Take your clothes off. And he did this thing called crotch eyeballing, where somebody would sit in a circle with their legs outstretched, and everybody would point to that person's genitals while chanting, "This is where it's at." So anyway, Elliot Barker loved it.
So that's what he was observing happening in California with treatment centers there.
And I think participating too.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And then so not long after that, he applied for a job working with psychopaths at the Oak Ridge Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Ontario, Canada. What were his initial observations about the psychopaths there?
Well, he felt that the vexing thing about psychopathy is that it's a madness that's buried deep within the surface. So he was trying to come up with ways to, his theory was if we can bring the madness to the surface, we can treat it. So...
what was his idea for treating it?
Well, naked psychotherapy. Not just naked psychotherapy, but mammoth LSD-fueled naked psychotherapy. So he got all the psychopaths in their unit, and I think some people with schizophrenia too, and he got them to take all of their clothes off, and he strapped them to each other, and he gave them massive doses of LSD. And what ensued...
And for days on end, wasn't it?
Epic. It could even have been like weeks on end.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact timeline, but it was long periods. And if they got hungry, they would suck liquid food that was coming out as straws that were protruding from the walls. One really odd thing is that if there were visitors, this was a psychiatric institute where, like school parties would come and visit to like destigmatize, mental health. And he was thinking like, well, I don't want to like break this, these like intense sessions. So once in a while, if a school child was like looking in at the naked psychopaths all like off their heads on LSD.
So many elements of this would just not happen again today.
I know, right? He had the school children wearing crime scene photographs around their necks. I know all this sounds very odd and implausible, but it's all kind of covered in academic papers that were written at the time. This is how I sort of found out the details.
Okay, so he would get a group of psychopaths together, give them LSD for days on end, and they were trapped in a small room.
Yeah, it's called a total encounter capsule.
I feel like if they weren't unwell going into this treatment, they probably emerged unwell from it?
Right. Well, this was his idea that the only way to cure psychopathy would be to do something as intense as that, which I guess is what he learned from the Northern Californian, intense sessions. Do something as intense as that to bring the madness to the surface, and then you could treat it. That was his theory.
And during this treatment, where everyone's, on LSD, trapped in a room for days on end, what would Elliot Barker be doing?
Just observing it all from the other side of a one-way mirror, as far as I can remember. And feeling very excited, because after a while, the psychopaths apparently began to change. They became more empathetic.
Yeah, what happened? How did they react at first, the men, and then, what happened?
Well, at first, I think it was sort of upsetting and dramatic. And I talked to one guy called Steve Smith, who was, according to Steve Smith, each psychopath was like strapped to another psychopath, and he was strapped to a notorious child murderer called Peter Woodcock, and who'd killed like 3 people. But then after a while, the psychopaths, according to Barker, began to change. Like it was working. They became more empathetic.
I want to hear more about Steve, though. What was his story? How did he end up there?
I think I only have his version of the story to go on, so I think I have to be a little cautious. But what he told me was that he was arrested in Canada. He was like a bit of a drifter, young man, and he stole a car, and he ended up in mental hospital, in this mental hospital, Oak Ridge, and they told him that he was a psychopath and he had to be part of the program. So he ended up just from this minor crime.
Right. So for to go with his story, it's pretty incredible that a young person who just stole a car ends up labelled a psychopath, strapped to a child killer.
Yes.
In treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. He's still very cross about it.
And so by the time you spoke to Steve, he was living a pretty normal life. Like, he wasn't in prison anymore. What was he doing?
I want to say something to do with windows. I think he was running some window company, if I remember right.
He was a tradie.
Yeah.
As Australians would say.
Right.
And so what happened to the men, Steve notwithstanding, what happened to the men inside of the capsule during the treatment? Did they change?
Yes, they apparently became more empathetic. And there's footage from this documentary that Steve sent me of them looking into each other's eyes and saying, how much they admire them. And so they seem to have completely changed. And then they were released. Hundreds of them were released. And many years later, 2 Canadian researchers did a long-term recidivism study, how many of the psychopaths who had been released after going through this program had gone on to reoffend. Now, in normal circumstances, 60% of high-scoring psychopaths who go to prison and then are released go on to reoffend. I think maybe the electricity generator experiment gives some insight into why, as if they forget the pain of the punishment. However, the psychopaths, the ones who had been through Elliot Barker's epic LSD-fueled naked psychotherapy sessions, 80%.
Oh, wow.
It had made them worse.
Why?
One of them was asked that, this child murderer, Peter Woodcock, and he said, it taught us how to fake empathy better.
Gosh. Okay, so it had the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's a very bleak story with no light at the end of the tunnel.
So when this was the result of that kind of very extreme treatment, where did that leave the field? Was that the end of trying to treat psychopaths?
Well, certainly when Robert Hare came along, sort of after Elliot Barker, he was much more hardline. In fact, the first way I found out about this whole Elliot Barker thing, which was a pretty unknown thing, it was Robert Hare. Robert Hare told me about it, and he was mocking it. He said they had psychopaths sitting on beanbags talking about their feelings. He thought the whole thing was ridiculous. And Hare was much more hardline. He wanted to root them out by any means necessary and basically get them out of society.
So once you finally learned how to spot psychopaths after doing Robert Hare's course, how did you feel with this new skill?
Oh, I felt amazing. I was immediately drunk with my psychopath spotting skills, and I was just very excited about trying them out.
A kind of a superpower. You could see these people that other people couldn't see coming.
Yeah, because the amazing thing about the checklist is that it is it's almost like Sherlock Holmes here. It's about reading between the lines, the nuances of somebody's behaviour. So it is a fascinating thing to learn how to spot psychopaths.
And you did say you don't have to be a psychologist or psychiatrist to get trained in this, and in fact a lot of the people who are getting trained weren't. Did you feel confident in being able to use it effectively, though?
Mostly I thought, this is great for my book. This is funny. I think I could probably see the absurd side of it. The absurd side being that I'd done this 3-day course. But, let me say again that that's not unusual. The people on the course there were people who worked in young offenders institutes doing this course, the kinds of people who would determine whether or not somebody should be locked up in a civil commitment centre and so on. But no, so I could see the kind of absurdity of it. And I thought it was sort of funny and good for my narrative. But also, I was kind of excited about this new power that I had, yeah.
And so how do you actually use the checklist? What do you learn to do? Do you just take a person through and say they answered yes or no? Or how does it work?
That's one way of doing it. And in fact, in subsequent years, I've brought out the psychopath checklist when I've interviewed some sort of problematic newspaper columnist or somebody, and I've said, look, I've got this psychopath checklist here. I'm not saying that you're a psychopath, but it might be an interesting way of constructing this interview, taking you through the checklist. But mostly it's not that. Mostly you're aware of the items on the checklist. You try and find out find sort of roundabout ways to get them to open up. So will I give you one example?
Yeah, well, let's talk about one of the people you spoke to in the book, which was Emmanuel Toto Constant. First of all, before you went through this checklist with him, tell us who he was.
Right, so he was a Haitian death squad leader. So I suppose a clue is in the job title. And he got away with it because he was working as a CIA informant at the time. So when a different party took over in Haiti, he fled Haiti and moved in with his mother in Queens, New York, and did a deal with the American government that as long as he stayed living with his mother and never went into Manhattan, which was like 4 miles away,
wow,
they'd leave him alone.
What was he like to meet?
Kind of frightening. When I first heard that story, I thought... a death squad leader who has to move back in with his mum. That's a funny story. So I went to see him.
In some ways, yeah.
Not funny.
Right.
All he wanted to do it was frustrating. He just wanted to protest his innocence. He was handsome, tall. He wore, very good suits. And had a charisma to him. Dapper is absolutely... Both when he was in Haiti, when you look at photographs of him in Haiti, he always wore like dapper suits. And when I met him at his mother's house, he was wearing a dapper suit. And at one point he started crying. And I looked at him and he was only pretending to cry.
How could you tell?
It was bad acting.
Oh.
Yeah, it was weird. And this was like maybe 10 years before I did the psychopath course. So none of it made any sense.
Crying about his... perceived victimhood? Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Exactly. And it was kind of, it was weird and I didn't like it.
Did you take him through the checklist or were you trying to deduce based on what he was saying?
Well, the first time I met him was years before I'd done the course.
Okay.
So this was like completely unconnected. So all of those things, just were confusing to me. But then after I did the course, I remembered all of this and I thought, okay, this all makes sense now because pretending to cry is shallow affect, which is one of the items on the list. And it says displays of emotion are shallow, short-lived, leaving the viewer the impression that they're play acting. And that's exactly what I felt when I was with Toto Constant that time and he pretended to cry.
What else did you pick up on his behaviour that made you think perhaps he ranks high on psychopathy?
There was this moment when we went into Manhattan because he had been invited to a party, so he was like flouting his agreement with the government.
Oh my gosh, because you had said he wasn't allowed to.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like the day I was with him, it's like, I'm going to a party in Manhattan, do you want to come?
Did not care about rules, right?
So, and at the end of my day with him in Manhattan, we said our goodbyes and big smiles, shook hands, and I turned away and I turned back to him. And in the instant I wasn't looking at him, his facial expression had totally changed. He was staring at me with these piercing eyes, these like cold, dead eyes. So again, I thought that was odd.
How did that make you feel when you saw that?
Sort of weird, like the whole thing. I never wrote about him for all of those reasons. I just thought I felt like, to be honest, I was really young the first time I met him. And all of that stuff was just odd. And I felt a little out of my depth and a little creeped out. And I never wrote about him. But then years later, when I did the psychopath course, I remembered all of these things. And I thought, okay, now it all makes sense. He will be the perfect person for me to try out my new psychopath spotting skills on. So I tracked him down again years later. And it turned out he was in prison in upstate New York doing 12 to 37 years for mortgage fraud.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So I went to visit him in prison. When I met him in prison, he was definitely less happy. He was a bit more kind of cowed. And I met him in the meeting room, and it was a horrible Shawshank Redemption type prison, Victorian prison. And I met him in like the canteen where you get to meet the prisoners. And there were some vending machines there. And he kind of pretty desperately said to me, buy me some hamburgers. So I kind of bought him a couple of hamburgers and he sort of wolfed them down. And it made me realise that this kind of pretty grim canteen was by far the best part of the prison.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and in fact, I think he said that to me. So being in prison, I think he hated it. And one of the reasons I think why he wanted to meet me was because it meant he got to spend a few hours in the canteen and could eat hamburgers from the vending machine and so on.
And you asked him about that feeling you got when he had that cold look on his face, right? What did he tell you?
He said that he observes people because it's very important to him to know whether or not they like him.
So that cold look was him observing you?
Yeah, observing me to figure out if I liked him or not.
And that's strange because you would think a psychopath doesn't care if people like them or not.
And I said that to him after he said a number of times to me, it's very important that people like me. Finally, I said that to him. I said, isn't that a weakness? And he said, no, it's not a weakness, because if you can get people to like you, you can manipulate them to do whatever you want them to do.
And did you at any point feel like you liked him? Was that working at all for you?
No, I don't think I ever liked him. I mean, he is a death squad leader.
Yeah.
So it's hard to like a death squad leader. As much as I try and find the good in everyone. He was terrible even by death squad leader standards, like the stuff that he had done, like awful things, setting fire to buildings with people inside them, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So was he a psychopath then?
I think he was definitely a psychopath, yeah.
Podcast. Broadcast. This is Conversations with Sana Kadar.
And Jon, you kept on with your psychopath spotting research, and you went to a town in Mississippi that once upon a time had been thriving, but not so much anymore. What did you find when you visited Shibuya, Mississippi?
Well, it was just a ghost town. The houses were just all broken and crumbled and falling in. They reminded me of that photograph of the person being shot in the face that I'd seen in the Hare course.
Gosh, a town reminded you of that.
Yeah, because these houses all just were like, the insides of the houses were like bubbling out. Like this town was just broken.
Wow.
And the reason why it was broken was because it was a factory town that was basically owned by Sunbeam, the kitchen appliance manufacturers. And they'd brought in this new CEO called Dunlap, who had shut down the factories, fired 30% of the workforce. And the reason why I was interested in Dunlap was because Fast Company magazine had just done a list of the 50 worst corporate psychopaths. And he was as far as I can remember, he was the only person on that list who was still alive. So I wrote to him, I thought, well, because Robert Hare had said to me, this kind of extraordinary thing, which was an entirely new thought at the time. He said, I wish I hadn't done all of my research in prisons. I wish I'd spent more time in boardrooms because corporate psychopaths are even worse than serial killer psychopaths, he said. Like a well-placed corporate psychopath can destroy a society.
Yeah, they're fascinating because I feel like people generally accept and expect psychopaths to be the murdering type. But don't necessarily think about them in the workplace or in leadership. I mean, now people do, because I think you were one of the first people to bring corporate psychopathy to the public consciousness. So now people are aware of it. But that's one type of psychopath you're perhaps more likely to encounter than the murdering type as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I've had one or two. And what's really interesting, right?
I've had one or two.
Right? And I don't know if this is true for you too, but I was in a situation, I won't kind of name any names or give away any
let's not
details.
name names.
No. But I remember I once worked for somebody like an editor who I've no idea if they were a psychopath or not, but they were certainly pushing me hard to tell more outrageous, better stories. And I noticed, not in any kind of big, terrible way, but just in a little way, my ethical framework, I would find myself going a little bit outside of it, telling a story that was just a little bit crueler because I was working for this person who was demanding it. And I thought about that a lot. It made me think, if you work for a corporate psychopath, maybe you have to be a little bit more psychopathic to keep up.
To survive.
Yeah.
Just because they're so ruthless and willing to be ruthless that, to compete, you have to do the same.
So a well-placed corporate psychopath can actually have a lot of influence.
Well, let's talk more about Al Dunlap then, because he was a very well-placed psychopath who, as you said, ruined this town of Shibuya by firing the workforce of Sunbeam. You actually visited him at his home. What was his home like?
A grand Florida mansion which was filled with sculptures and paintings of predatory animals.
What did that tell you about his worldview?
Well, it says in the psychopath checklist that they see the world in terms of predators and prey, and that it would be foolish not to exploit weaknesses in others.
Gosh.
And and he's not the only one. Lots of leaders have sort of predatory animal decor.
And so with Al Dunlap, unlike with Toto Constant, you actually took Al through the psychopath checklist. How did he respond to the various items on that checklist?
He kind of turned them into business positives. So cunning manipulative was just, leadership, business leadership. Impulsivity was quick thinking in the marketplace. So he kind of turned them all. I got to say, by the way, that when I approached him, I didn't say, can I come and interview you to find out if you're a psychopath? I said, I believe you may have a very special brain anomaly that makes you fearless and interested in the predatory spirit.
Much more fawning.
Yeah. And, cunning manipulatives on the psychopath checklist. So there I was being a little bit psychopathic in the way I emailed the guy.
And so did you also show him like a graphic, gory photo like you'd been shown in the Robert Hare training to see how his amygdala reacted?
I didn't, but I did say to him, if you see a photograph of a crime scene, how do you respond? Do you recoil in horror? And he said, no, I look at it with curiosity. So he again said almost exactly the same thing that Robert Hare says that psychopaths do in that situation.
And when he was spinning all those checklist items into business positives, what did you make of that?
I mean, I thought it was funny, and I thought I was getting a great chapter from a book. It's on top of that, I thought these aren't values that I think we should want in society. We shouldn't want our leaders and our sort of cultural leaders to espouse items on the checklist as positives. It's like it's not good. There's a counter to it. There's a book out there by a professor called Kevin Dutton called The Wisdom of Psychopaths, where he says the opposite. He says that psychopathy can be a net positive in society.
Interesting.
Yeah, because they make good surgeons, they make good sharpshooters. So that's his point. But actually, when I was doing the Hare course, there was an army recruitment officer on the course. And I said to him, are you doing this because you want psychopaths because they're presumably very cool under pressure in wars? And he said, no, the opposite. He said, they make terrible team players, so I don't want psychopaths. I want to root them out because you need to be a team player if you're in the army.
Yeah, right. In terms of the rewarding that behavior, though, the interesting thing with Al Dunlap is, he did amazing things for the company's Sunbeam's share price, despite these not very nice tendencies.
The share price skyrocketed after they found out that Al Dunlap was going to be the new CEO, and his reputation preceded him. So who's the psychopath? Is it Al Dunlap or is it the shareholders?
And what was your conclusion with Al Dunlap? Was he a psychopath?
He certainly said no to some of the items on the checklist. He said no to many short-term marital relationships, which is one of the items. He's only been married twice. He said no to a few of the other items. Oh, juvenile delinquency. He said he got accepted into West Point, the Army College in Connecticut, I think it is. And he said they don't let delinquents into West Point. So I noticed something about myself then, which was that when he said that to me, my first thought was, oh, well, I won't put that in my book.
Like, won't include the no answers, just the yes, right?
And of course, what does that say about us? Like, becoming a psychopath hunter had turned me a little bit psychopathic in my desire to, shove him in a box-marked psychopath and ignore all the more nuanced stuff. So that was a real kind of wake-up for me that, I was getting drunk with my psychopath spotting skills.
It sounds like you were very self-aware through the process, though.
I was, but there was a moment when I did think to myself, I mean, it was a very fleeting moment where I thought, oh, well, maybe I just won't put that in my book. And I was so pleased to have kind of clutched hold of that thought because it was so, morally clarifying for me. Like I was losing my way. And for me as a nonfiction, the kind of nonfiction books that I write, thoughts like that, where suddenly everything gets turned on its head, is wonderful.
So you've talked about how capitalism seems to reward a lot of psychopathic behavior. Is there something unique about American capitalism, do you think, that rewards this behavior in particular, or is this a global thing?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously this idea of, leave us alone, don't tread on me.
The individualistic nature of American society.
Yeah, I'd say is probably, prods at those things more. I mean, the difference, having lived in Britain and America and just looking at the difference in the healthcare systems, you see, such a huge disconnect. So maybe the difference in America is that, there's still kind of war on the working classes, death of the factories and so on, but there's also no support network. If you're screwed in America, you suddenly landed, with a massive medical bill. Maybe America is a little bit more psychopathic.
I also wondered if whether there were different cultural interpretations of psychopathy. So like in America, individualistic, it's seen as ruthless leadership and it's rewarded. But how does that differ to collectivist cultures like Europe or not even Europe, Asia, parts of Asia? Do you know how the difference... do you know how psychopathy is thought of differently in different parts of the world?
In Asia, I don't know because I've not done any research. But when I think about Europe, do you know about this scandal in Britain called Partygate?
Yes, Boris Johnson partying in 10 Downing during COVID lockdowns.
So you've got that famous photograph of the Queen at Prince Philip's funeral sitting alone in the church with her mask on. And the night before, so she was, epitomising Britain, wanting to do everything right. Wanting to do the right thing. If your elderly relative dies, you don't go and visit them in hospital because this is what the government was telling us. Britain really prides itself on that doing the right thing. And then it turns out that, Boris Johnson and the Conservative government and the civil servants were all partying the whole time. And it was, I think I was talking about this to some Americans, and they didn't get it. It's like, oh, what? So Boris Johnson had to resign because he had a couple of parties and they thought this was just kind of nuts.
Right.
And I explained, no, this gets to the very fabric of what matters to people in Britain. Yeah. And when you think about Partygates, that's like the epitome of psychopathy because it's
total lack of empathy for what others were going through. Total
lack of empathy, grandiose self-worth, the rules don't apply to us. Need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, that's another item on the checklist. I think if a particular political scandal, I can't think of any that's kind of more psychopathic than Partygate.
Speaking of politicians, I have to ask about Trump. You've said in previous interviews you reckon he's not a psychopath, but he's a narcissist. Why?
Well, first I should say that I think one ought to feel a bit uncomfortable sort of armchair diagnosing people. Yeah. My book is a sort of cautionary tale not to do that.
Right.
However, Trump's been in our lives for a long time now, and we have more information about Trump than I think most clinicians have when they decide whether somebody's a psychopath or not. Right. So I don't think it's entirely unfair to speculate.
Okay, good defence, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what's going on under the surface with Trump? Is there a kind of volcano of emotions that he can't handle, so he suppresses them and then lashes out? And if that's the case, he's a narcissist. Or is what's going on underneath the surface with Trump nothing? And if that's the case, then he's a psychopath. And personally, I think it's more likely to be the former.
The volcanic sort of retribution and all of that.
He seems like a very emotional person.
Just to finish off on Trump, you also told the Independent newspaper if you had to put money on it, you'd say Kamala was going to win the election, and you couldn't bear another 4 years of Trump. You now live in the States. How are you feeling now post the election?
Yeah, I got annoyed with myself actually for saying that, because a couple of times I said I think Trump's going to win because it's such a gendered election, and maybe winning over the men in the way that he did is going to tip it. So I kind of got annoyed with myself and then changing my mind and saying I thought... The only reason why I changed my mind and thought Kamala was going to win was because of this poll that came out about Iowa, where it said that she was 3 points ahead in Iowa. So I just sort of felt this huge sigh of relief. And I thought, and the pollster was a particularly respected pollster as well. So that's really the only reason. Yet again, I didn't go with my instincts. I went with the experts. And I wasn't get annoyed when I do that. And then it turns out that they were wrong and my initial instincts were right.
So how do you feel now? Post?
Well, it's funny. I think a lot of people are responding the way that I am, which is that the first 4 years of the Trump presidency, I personally was on high alert constantly. I would watch CNN every night. I'd watch Anderson Cooper. I used to joke that CNN was my QAnon and Anderson Cooper was my Q, because I'd watch every night and just believe anything that he said. And actually, I sort of regret it.
Okay,
I felt like I was getting a very partial... I love Anderson Cooper and I love CNN, don't get me wrong. But I felt for the 4 years of the Trump presidency, I was getting a very partial view of what was going on. And I wasn't getting the full picture. The fact that he almost won again. He almost won in 2020. And you would never have thought that from watching CNN. And I also regret thinking about it so much. Trump was in my head every day for 4 years. When's the Mueller report going to come out? When are we going to find out about, Russiagate and so on? Trump talks about people having Trump derangement syndrome. I had Trump derangement syndrome.
Right.
So this time around, I'm just going to be a little bit more just a little bit less emotional about the whole thing and just sort of wait and see what happens. It could be an utter disaster. I think one of the reasons why Trump won is because the moment when he really did try and undermine democracy with January the 6th and refusing to accept the election and so on, the institution still held, democracy held. When democracy was really under attack, it still held. And I think this time around, another reason why Trump won is because people were less frightened of him. They thought, well, he didn't do that much damage in those 4 years.
So he can't be that bad.
He can't be that bad.
Coming back to psychopathy and how we talk about it and mental illness more broadly, there's an interesting change happening, not just with how we talk about mental illness in general, but psychopathy specifically. So it used to be the case that you'd never really hear from psychopaths talking about their behaviour, analysing their behaviour. But now there's a subset of people quite willing to identify as psychopaths and sociopaths, which is kind of interchangeable. Yes. Like you talked about Kanika, the TikToker, the sociopath influencer. There was also an American woman, Patrick Gagney, who wrote a memoir titled Sociopath about her diagnosis and life. What do you make of this newfound willingness to self-identify?
I think broadly, it's positive, because I think anything that brings stuff out into the open and destigmatizes any kind of mental health condition is very positive.
Is it curious, though, that now all of a sudden people are willing to talk about it?
I think so. It's certainly a very big change. And of course, as you say, it's not just psychopathy. It's many diagnoses and self-diagnoses. And I think sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive. So can I give you an example of both?
Yeah.
Okay, so an example of when an expansion of mental health diagnosis is negative, I would say, is trauma. So the idea that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD was always supposed to be for people who'd been through some really terrible things. Soldiers in wars, victims of sexual assault, children diagnosed with cancer and their parents. But during lockdown, all of that changed. Everybody started diagnosing themselves with trauma and started kind of wielding trauma as a bit of a weapon. So there's this famous, it's not that famous, but there's a story in Oregon about how the students were protesting their lecturer because they were being forced to read Plato, which they said was a white supremacist text, and it was traumatizing to them to be forced to read the white supremacist Plato. And so they would disrupt the lecturers and hold up placards and yell in the face of the lecturer. And the lecturer, her name was Lucia, had diagnosed PTSD.
Right.
So she eventually said to them, look, your protests are triggering my symptoms. Will you please stop? And they responded with an open letter to Lucia where they said that she was creating a hierarchy of trauma where her traumas mattered more. So that feels to me like a bad example of an expansion of mental health. But on the other side, I'm really interested in the expansion of autism, which I think is much more positive. I'm convinced that there's huge numbers of people out there who are autistic and just don't know it. And it means that they don't know why they can't handle parties. If they go to a noisy restaurant, everybody else seems to be fine, but they're not fine because all the overlapping chatter is like driving them nuts. Some people can go to like a noisy restaurant and filter out the noise that they don't want to hear, whereas, and then just concentrate on the conversation that they're having with somebody. But autistic people, I think, can't do that. It's like the mixing board, all the things are on like full, and you can't filter out any noises. Right. And there's certain fabrics that they can't handle. And so I think for people like that, a diagnosis of autism is a really positive thing. So that's an example of an expansion of mental health diagnosis that I think has been very good for society.
And so where does psychopathy fit in with all of that, the positive, the negative?
Well, personally, I don't think there's anything positive really about psychopathy.
Yeah, because it's kind of, this trend also dovetails with the wider trend of destigmatization. And I've thought about, people who have psychopathy haven't chosen to have that. But they can be also very dangerous. So should psychopathy be destigmatized?
It's a really good question. I think, destigmatization is just, basically kind of pretty much always good. Like, I'm all for destigmatization. But what I don't think we should be doing is rewarding or valuing or supporting items on the psychopath checklist, because these are bad things. Lack of empathy, pathological lying, grandiosity. These aren't values that we should be endorsing as a society. They're just not. And yet we are. We're making them our leaders. We're making them our CEOs. We're encouraging lying and lack of empathy on social media. That's the kind of value that I think we should not be encouraging.
How did researching psychopaths and spending time around psychopaths, did it affect your own mental health? Like you talked about it sort of was starting to make you act slightly psychopathic in certain ways. But did it affect your mental health spending time with people who, committed really violent crimes or done other horrible things?
To be honest, no. I love storytelling and I love having adventures, and I particularly the reason why I love having adventures is because I love storytelling. I love sitting alone in my room, making stories work perfectly. And I have to say, I don't know if this makes me a psychopath, but I have to say, there's nothing better than telling good stories. And so writing the psychopath test was kind of great for me for that reason. I just thought this is a great story, and I love sitting alone, just fiddling away like a dollhouse maker. What was more frightening and destabilising for me, much more actually, was my subsequent book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. I wrote it before the phrase cancel culture was invented, but it was kind of about that, about our proclivity to just destroy somebody on social media for the scantest evidence. And that impacted me both psychologically, like how horrible we are as humans. We're just ordinary people. Psychopaths are like exceptional people. But when we tear somebody apart for nothing on social media, that's all of us. We all do it pretty much. And it's so that really depressed me. And also the fear, about what am I doing, bringing these kind of unpopular ideas out into the world that we shouldn't be destroying everybody on social media all the time. We shouldn't be just constantly shaming people for everything.
Did you get shamed? Did you get attemptedly cancelled?
Oh, God, yeah. But it did nothing. I mean, yes, and it was kind of awful. I remember, a small group of people just doing everything they could to try and bring me down because of that book. So, the psychopath test was by and large, I kind of enjoyed. I was worried about what would Robert Hare think, because I'm sort of slightly critical of, some aspects of the checklist and mental health and, labelling people psychopaths. But by and large, my memories of the psychopath test were very good.
Finally, I suppose for anyone listening who has been recognising some of themselves in some of the checklist items and thinking, oh my gosh, do I have psychopathic traits? Am I a psychopath? What then? What should they be worried?
Well, if you're worried that you might be a psychopath, that means you aren't one, because psychopaths never worry about being psychopaths. What's there to worry about? No empathy, no guilt, no remorse. I often think it must be the most kind of pleasant feeling of all the mental disorders. So the good news is if you're listening to this feeling worried you might be a psychopath, I think you're not one.
Comforting.
But if you're listening to this and thinking, oh, maybe I am a psychopath, and feeling kind of good about it, then go for it. Just try not to hurt anyone.
Jon, it's been so fun talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a real pleasure.
Conversations with Sana Kadar.
My guest today was Jon Ronson. Today's program was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people. It was produced by Alice Moldovan. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sana Kadar. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
When a banana farmer in far north Queensland claimed to have seen a flying saucer and said it had left behind a mysterious mark, it unleashed a firestorm of hysteria.
Did you see it? What do they look like? Are they aliens?
That moment would haunt him for decades, not to mention inspire an international hoax. I'm Danielle O'Neill, and this story from Australia was where the modern crop circle phenomena all started. Search for Expanse on the ABC Listen app.